Welcome then to the review of this Aprilia Tuono 663 factory. New for 2022, they've changed from the standard Tuono to the factory and it's got a few little differences. Now mainly this is an Aprilia RS 660 in an upright chassis. Now I know what you're thinking, isn't that what the Tuono was previously? Well no, because the standard Tuono you don't get adjustable forks, you don't get a quick shifter and auto blipper, you don't get cornering ABS. There's a couple of little differences, and also you don't get this factory dark paint scheme. Now, if I'm honest, I'm not a huge fan of the factory dark. I think the standard colour schemes are a lot better. So what do you get for your £10,000 list price? Well, let me tell you. You get, as standard on this bike, cornering ABS, so that's dual Brembos up front on 320mm discs with an IMU, meaning that when you lean over, the ABS is lean sensitive, so if you grab a handful, it actually measures how much lean angle you've got and doesn't give you a fistful of nothing just when you need it. You also get a quick shifter and an auto blipper. Now if you've not ridden with either of those and you're not familiar with those terms, a quick shifter means that you can keep the throttle wide open and upshift and it'll change gear for you, and an auto blipper means that you can tap down on the gear lever without using the clutch and it'll change down for you. You also get a beautiful TFT dash, you get fully adjustable front and rear suspension. It's a Kayaba 41mm at the front and it's a Sachs unit at the back. Coupled with those Brembos at the front is of course a Brembo radial master cylinder. This factory model as well has also managed to drop a couple of kilos over the standard bike. Now that isn't a huge change, but nonetheless it's still welcome. Peak power is up slightly from before, it's now 100 horsepower and it makes that at 10,500 RPM. The torque, that's about 48 foot-pounds and it makes that at 8,500 RPM, which sounds like quite high in the rev range, particularly considering this is a parallel twin 660. You would think that perhaps it's lower down and because it's got so much at the top end it's lacking elsewhere. That's not the case. You also get 5 riding modes, which is something that most people will make use of. Those 5 riding modes are commute, dynamic, individual, and then you get 2 race or track modes. You have to go into the menu to get a hold of them, but it's pretty easy to do so. But what isn't as easy is coming back out of the menu to put it back into road mode. Out of those 5 riding modes, 2 of them are user configurable, which means that you can change the engine mapping, you can change the engine braking, you can change the level of traction control you have, you can turn anti-wheelie on and off, and you can also control how intrusive or not the ABS is. Some of the changes make more than others. For example, the engine braking, I don't honestly find that it makes a huge difference, whereas the ABS, you can disable it and turn off the rear ABS, so that does make a big difference and you will notice it. So that all sounds fantastic, but what's it like to ride? Well, that's why we're down here at the Southwest 660 to bring together a little bit of synergy of 660 engine and 660 miles of coastline to ride around and enjoy. After riding this bike for quite a while around the Southwest 660, here's what I've got to say about it. Let's start at the front end. The headlights, they're absolutely fantastic. I've ridden through the night a couple of times and honestly, the field of view you get and how bright the light is, even on dip beam, let alone main beam, is just amazing. The brakes are so good, as you'd expect. It's got a radial Brembo master cylinder and it's got twin radial calipers with 320mm discs, and the feel that you get at the lever, the initial bite isn't perfect, but as soon as you get that initial bite done, it's got so much feel. You can trail the brakes into corners. It's absolutely fantastic. Let's go on to the suspension then. The suspension, it is fully adjustable front and rear, and actually it's a little bit crashy for me. I haven't had a chance to have a play with it and set it up, so it might just be set up, but one thing I have noticed is that actually the rear end, usually bikes tend to be a bit soft on the rear end due to budget considerations. They don't put a big enough spring in, but even in my riding gear I haven't felt the rear end lacking and the front end really hasn't either. So the riding position then, tell you what, let's just sit on it and show you. So riding position, it's a little bit racy, you're leant forward just a touch, so it is a sporty naked, that's the way they're dealing with this, but it's not too uncomfortable. But what I did find is after about an hour, hour and a half, the bum starts to get a little bit uncomfortable, there's a little bit of weight on your wrists, and actually your hips and knees, or certainly I found it, they were just starting to go ever so slightly. So about an hour and a half is probably the maximum you're going to be riding this bike. But that might not be strictly fair, because that was for me sat on a dual carriageway, not riding through twisties and moving around on the bike, so perhaps being a little bit unfair. The bars then, there's plenty going on the bars with this bike. First off, on the left hand switchgear, you've got all the buttons to get into the menus and sort things out. You've also got the cruise control button on here as well, and actually I'm not usually a fan of cruise control on a bike. I don't think it's necessary, I think it's just a gimmick, but riding on a dual carriageway today, it came in really handy. On the right hand side bars, that's where your mode switch is, so you can switch from your riding modes, and you can do that while you're on the move. The three main ones are commute, dynamic and individual. And individual is the one that you can configure, you can set up for yourself, and you can change the engine braking, you can change the engine mapping, so what the throttle response is like, you can change the traction control. There's 8 settings to choose from on traction control. You can turn the anti-wheelie on and off, and you can also turn the ABS up and down. 2 more modes as well, another one of which is configurable. These are the race modes, and you have to go into the menu to get to them. One of the things that happens with the race mode is what was the cruise control button now becomes your traction control level setting, and you can do that again while you're on the move. So you could go out on a wet track in the morning, and as it starts to dry out, you can just nudge it down and turn the traction control off, or vice versa. Moving further back then, the tank. The tank, actually, I find it a really nice shape. Your knees really grip up under here. It's a fantastic place to sit, but it's just not big enough. It's only 15 litres, and actually on one ride, I've seen the fuel light come on at around 94 miles, which, bearing in mind it has 4 litres in reserve, you've got a tank range of about 120 miles, and it's just not enough. With just a couple of extra litres, say to 17 litres, you'd probably push that range up to 140, 150 mile range, which is really, it's enough. 120 just isn't. An extra 30 miles of range really wouldn't have gone amiss. I'm a real fan of this engine. I like it in all the platforms they do it, in the Touareg, in the RS660, and in this, the Tuono. Now it's 100 horsepower, which doesn't sound like enough, and some people have made comments that maybe you get this bike before you move on to a bigger bike, and I totally disagree. 100 horsepower is more than enough for the road. It's got plenty of overtaking ability, and it's really good fun to ride. From about 4,000 RPM, it really starts to get some gusto behind it. It wants to urge you on, and it's really playful. Every time I've got the revs going, it's made me want to give it a little bit more, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more. It really eggs you on, so it is a little bit of a hooligan in that sense, that it kind of tempts you. It's always tempting you to just open the throttle a little bit harder, because the noise it makes is fantastic. Both the induction noise and the exhaust noise. Now the exhaust, yes, it's standard and it's not that loud, which is kind of a good thing, I think. But you do get a load of pops and bangs and crackles, both on the overrun, also when you're using the quick shifter and blipper. It's just really nice to hear. And it's one of those things that it makes you smile, let's face it. I might love the engine, however, but the gearbox, it lets this bike down a little bit. Now it does have a quick shifter and an auto blipper, which you don't really need on the road, but it is a lot of fun. But the quick shifter, it needs a really positive shift on the way up, and both the blipper on the way down needs a really good stab on the way down too. Something I've noticed though is it's a little bit clunky either way, and also finding neutral has been an absolute ball ache on this bike. I thought all of those issues that Aprilia had were gone from yesteryear with the early RSVs and RSV4s. They had problems finding neutral too, and I thought that was a thing of the past. 2 other minor things that I found a bit of a pain with this bike. Both happen to be in and around the clutch area. Now the clutch itself, it's non-adjustable, or the lever's non-adjustable I should say, which I don't have particularly small hands, I wear a medium-sized glove, but I've just found occasionally the clutch is that little bit far to reach. Now it's quite nice and light in action, but it just feels like a mistrick to not be able to adjust the lever, and you're probably going to spend somewhere between 40 and 120 pounds, depending on your level of taste, to get that sorted, particularly if you've got really big hands or really small hands, you just might struggle. Staying on this side then, what I have found is, because I am reaching a little bit far to try and grab the lever sometimes, I occasionally knock the flash switch. So I've noticed a few times when I look down at the dash, I'm actually looking at a big blue light that says I've turned my high beams on. Didn't notice I'd done it, but it is something that's happened a few times. Finally, the fit and finish on this bike, it's not 100% perfect. I've noticed around the fuel tank cap, you know, if you're one of those people, just like me, who wants to get the last few drops of fuel out, and why wouldn't you when it costs so much nowadays. It has just seemed to mark around the tank cap, and that's a shame. As well, the tank has picked up a few little scuffs and scratches, and this bike has less than 1,000 miles on it. Overall then, you get a lot of kit for your money, but if you're looking for a bike like this, and this one costs £10,000 list price, you may want to look a little bit further at some of its competitors. The KTM 890 Duke, that's got more power, it costs less, it weighs less, and has a ton more torque. The MT-09 also costs less, also has more power. You've also got something like the Triple RS, starts a little bit more money than this, but it's just as high spec, and you get more power and a larger fuel tank. But if you like your Italian bikes, Ducati Monster 939, that makes more power again, albeit it weighs more, but it does cost a little bit more as well, £10,295, all things to consider. Overall then, it's a bike with a few little niggles and issues, but you can overlook almost all of them for how good it is everywhere else. The riding position means that it's comfortable around town. When you get it out on the open road, the bars are nice and wide, you can give them a flick when it gets through a little twisties, and it's just a really nice place to be. The brakes are fantastic, the engine eggs you want to ride more, the throttle's fantastic, it's even really economical. Appreciate the tank is small, but it does 60 to the gallon most of the time. What more could you want? Well, after all then, there's not much else to say, but thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and ride safe. We'll see you in the next one. Take care.